Hear these words, first from the prophet Micah, and then from the gospel writer Mark. God has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does God require of you but to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God? And from Mark, one of the scribes came near and asked Jesus, which commandment is the first of all? Jesus answered, the first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. My purpose in choosing these two texts is that I would like you to consider them, not just now, but during the period that we call Lent. This is Black History Month. Several weeks ago, I watched a PBS special, Freedom Riders, in American Experience. It was first aired in 2011, but I didn't watch too much PBS back then. Now it's probably the only channel that I look at with great impact. But my point isn't to tell you about my television choices, nor is my point to discuss politics. My point is to share what that program did to me and for me. Racial issues have been front and center in the news lately, especially since so many politicians and parents want to ban their children from hearing about our nation's past. Apparently, many people think that if we just ignore something or refuse to talk about it, it will just go away. But you can't erase history. It looms its ugly head and refuses to be ignored. How can we as Americans and as Christians choose to forget that in the early days of our country, we were scarred by slavery? Do we think that if we don't mention it in our history books, it will just disappear? Are we really that naive? I, for one, can tell you that I learned very little in my history classes in high school about slavery, but it was mentioned, though not sufficiently considering how it impacted our nation. Our history books minimize, if not entirely skip over, the fact that we as a country enslaved people from Africa. Slavery wasn't a one-time event. It didn't happen on a singular day, but existed for much of our history. Many people consider a significant starting point to slavery in America to be in 1619, when the privateer, the White Lion, brought 20 enslaved Africans ashore to the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia. After the Revolutionary War, the new U.S. Constitution tacitly acknowledged the institution of slavery, counting each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of taxation and representation in Congress, and guaranteeing the right to repossess any person held in service or labor. Think about that. The color of someone's skin relegated them to be only a partial person. How did that happen? How could it happen? It happened, I suppose, because most of the signers of the Constitution were slave owners. In an article written for the 400th anniversary of our Constitution, evidence shows that of the 47 men in the famous Declaration of Independence painting, they were slaveholders, most being 34. That's 72%. And we want to pretend that slavery wasn't prominent in the 17th and 18th centuries. Well, we can attempt to cover up what happened in those long ago times, but we can't erase it. The fact is that although slavery was abolished in 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment, the position of those who were freed in the South was precarious. We know the ugly history. Provisions of the Constitution were often ignored or violated, and it was difficult for black citizens to gain a foothold in the post-war economy. And when we talk about post-war, we're talking about the Civil War, but we might just as well be talking about the wars that we've just had in the 20th century. Several years ago, the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference of the UCC held its annual meeting in Tulsa, and we had the opportunity to visit the museum that commemorates the Tulsa Race Massacre. We learned that in an 18-hour period, and think about that, from May 31st to June 1st, 1921, it's estimated that between 100 and 300 people were killed, and more than 8,000 people were made homeless. This happened in an area known as Black Wall Street, the Greenwood section of Tulsa. The city tried to cover it up. The newspaper actually removed the first page of the newspaper, and police and militia archives went missing. My point in saying what I saw and heard about the massacre is to say that this didn't happen somewhere in our remote past. It happened 100 years ago. Hatred doesn't tend to die. It festers. We only need to consider the many deaths recently caused by hatred. Which moves me ahead to the PBS program on the Freedom Riders. I already heard with some familiarity about Bloody Sunday in 1965 on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama, when police attacked civil rights movement demonstrators with horses, billy clubs, and tear gas as they were attempting to march across the bridge. The bridge serves as a vivid reminder of how the South still perpetuates the ugly history of slavery. The man for whom the bridge was named was not only a Confederate general, he was a leader in the Ku Klux Klan. The bridge was named for him in part to memorialize his history of restraining and imprisoning African Americans in their quest for freedom after the Civil War. As for the Freedom Riders, they were a group of young white and black men and women who rode buses in the South in 1961 in an attempt to end racial segregation in public transportation. What we may fail to realize was that in 1946, 15 years before the Freedom Riders, the U.S. Supreme Court had banned segregation in interstate bus travel. And in 1960, the earlier ruling was extended to include bus terminals, restrooms, and other facilities involved in interstate travel. That notwithstanding, the Deep South continued to segregate almost all of its facilities. And even though the federal government knew the riders were being beaten and their buses firebombed, almost nothing was done to help them in their struggles. Again and again, they were beaten and jailed, and law enforcement was suspiciously late in responding, and there were suspicions of collusion in that late response. Eventually, only after the brutality could no longer be ignored did the federal government intercede, and their efforts, to say the least, were minimal. I lost a great deal of respect for those in government at that time for allowing this brutality to continue. And brutality is an accurate word. I'm sure that by now some of you are wondering why I'm preaching on these events, because this is an issue that can no longer be ignored. If you recall my sermon last week, Micah spoke for God and asks, "What does God require of you but to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God?" What part of that do not Christians understand? It's now more than 60 years since the struggle for human rights, and not a great deal has changed. The 13th Amendment in 1865 banned slavery. The 14th Amendment assured that all people born and naturalized in the United States were citizens, and states could not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, guaranteed every citizen the right to vote. Yet here we are in 2023, more than 150 years after these amendments were passed, and the issues of race within the United States have yet to be resolved. Some states do everything possible to prevent people from voting, and law enforcement still seems to struggle with treating all people equally. And if that's not bad enough, now states are working to prevent the teaching of our history. And let's not pretend this is our history, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. Is it any wonder why our country continues to have issues with race? And in case we think this only happens in the South, consider what happened in Kansas City. The Chiefs, our Super Bowl heroes, began recruiting black men for the team in 1966. Yet few of any of them could find a place to live. We're talking about Mike Garrett and Bobby Bell, significant players for the Chiefs. So if anyone thinks that Kansas City is immune from prejudice, think again. The article that was written about the Chiefs and its black players appeared in all places in the Washington Post. It's unfortunate that it wasn't written in the Kansas City Star. Yet Kansas City did decide to rename areas named for J.C. Nichols, who was responsible for much of the redlining in the area. That was at least some acknowledgement of how racial Kansas City still is. And now we want to ban history books that write about this. Do we really think that banning books and preventing the teaching of these subjects will ban them from our corporate memory. It pains me to acknowledge that it took more than 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation for enslaved Americans in Galveston, Texas, to receive word that they were freed. That happened on June 19th, 1865. And we now celebrate that freedom from bondage by our national holiday of Juneteenth. It's a day in which we remember the moral stain and terrible toll of slavery in our country, what has been called America's original sin, a long legacy of systemic racism, inequality, and inhumanity. It's been said that great nations don't ignore the most painful chapters of their past. Great nations confront them. They come to terms with them. But we haven't come to terms with them. Does that mean we're not a great nation? I'll leave that for you to decide. All I can say is when I reviewed the documentary on the Freedom Riders, my heart broke. I watched as mobs of mostly white men transformed from human beings into animals. Yet perhaps that's unfair to animals. I somehow refuse to acknowledge that any human beings could do that to other human beings. It is beyond my brain to comprehend. Is our hatred so deep, even now in the 21st century, that some of our fellow citizens continue to demonstrate this kind of rage? I want to say no, but I have to say yes. We have only to recall the incident which happened recently to Tyree Nichols in Memphis to realize that deep hatred still exists in this country and is deeply rooted. The police who killed Tyra were black, which only goes to show that rage can turn in upon itself, and it seems to be never ending. And make no mistake, much of this history was created by people who say they are Christians. If this is what Christians are, is it any wonder why so many young people no longer come to church? Think about that. We have just entered the season of Lent. Lent is a season of penitence, of regret for sin and wrongdoing. Repentance adds the implication of a resolve to change. I suggest that this Lent, we resolve to make things better, to not pretend that parts of our history, the ugly, shameful parts, don't exist. We as citizens are better than that. And we as Christians who say we follow Jesus knows that he grieves for what we have done and what we continue to do. Let us resolve this Lent to do better. Amen.